My wife is the smartest, most put-together human being I've ever had the pleasure of knowing. It baffles me how such an angel as her could settle for a mess like me. Not only did she agree to put up with me for the rest of her life, but she also decided that we should have a child. This amazing person who fucking killed it in university and ran her own business that was successful enough to keep more than 24 people comfortable, wanted to procreate with a cunt who barely even finished his GCSEs. It made no sense. But the thing about Sarah is that she's a stubborn bitch, right? So when she's made her mind up about something, it's very hard to talk her out of it. Not that I tried very hard to do so. Hey, while I was busy shitting enough bricks to build a house too big for us to afford, she planned out every single thing down to the most minute details. Her diet, how she'd exercise, how the birth would go down, what the kid's bloody room would look like. All was decided before the test even came back positive. It was like emasculating, to be frank, but my only job was to bring my dick along, and I'm sure I almost fucked that up too. She was kind enough to let me take care of her the best of my ability during the pregnancy. With all her planning, she'd forgotten to take into account the human person that she'd have growing in her belly during all that time, and the difficulties that come with that. It truly was one of the most terrifying things I've ever experienced. I mean, I feel like that anticipation built over the months until I could barely breathe. Sarah did her best to soothe me, but it felt silly to go whining to her about being nervous. She was the one doing the hard work. But when Alfie was born, all those nerves blinked away. Jumbled puzzle pieces of the world suddenly clicked together to finally form a picture that I'd been looking for. Before becoming a father, it was like I'd been standing in one of those hall of mirrors, right? Unable to figure out which way was forward, having to rely on Sarah's hand to guide me. But when I held him in my arms, for the first time, I was suddenly on a straight open path. The purpose I'd never been able to find for my entire life was suddenly right in front of me. And that feeling even survived him, immediately releasing more shit from his ass than I think I'd ever seen before, all down the front of my clothes. Clothes I then had to go home wearing. I'm not going to pretend I was some kind of natural, right? Fucking things up is my number one talent, and I was still doing plenty of it. I was permanently exhausted, but I grew up spending entire weeks sleepless while grinding for rare gear in various video games. So I was trained to resist the weight of fatigue, but I turned out to be pretty damn good at being a dad. I can't take all the credit. I mean, Sarah made sure that I'd studied a countless number of books on the subject back to front, but sitting with my son, I'd think back to all those times other parents had warned me. You know, they told me I'd resent the lack of sleep, that I'd be miserable for at least the first few months, if not years. But none of that turned out to be true. I mean, I was unbothered by all that shit. I had my son. Nothing else mattered. My wife, she had a harder time. She learned quickly that being a mother isn't like running a company, that the primary directive of all children is to shatter every plan their parents concocted, right? With all her research and preparations with the physical side, I don't think she ever guessed the kind of toll giving birth would take on her mental health. Some days she couldn't even get herself out of bed, feeling tired all the time. She couldn't work. I mean, I love Sarah, but if there's one thing she's terrible at, it's sitting still. So while trying to recover from having her insides ripped out, she was beating herself up for resting instead of single-handedly holding up the sky. I often found myself holding her, telling her that she was a good mom, reminding her how badass she was, while she felt like she was failing. It broke my heart to see my smart, confident wife crumble apart like that. It felt so fucking useless, not knowing the right words to say, though. As it shamed me to admit it, it felt good to be the one comforting her for once, even if I was shit at it, right? My mother suggested that maybe Sarah was suffering from some kind of postpartum depression. She explained what it was, telling me about how she'd gone through something similar after I was born. I managed to convince my wife to start seeing a shrink, which helped. She still had her moments, but the color was returning to her, and she was able to get out of bed more, even leave the house, right? So one day, when Alfie was about a month and a half old, she came home from a day out with him looking on the verge of a breakdown. And I asked what was wrong. She practically collapsed into my arms. I almost lost him, she whimpered to me. After calming her down and putting Alfie to bed, I got the full story from her. She took her eyes off him. It was a tiny, insignificant amount of time that turned out to be a travesty. She stepped away for maybe a minute to quickly grab something, and when she returned, he was gone. A frantic few minutes proceeded where she searched desperately, eventually finding him still in his pram not too far away. I soothed her as she cried, telling her that one mistake didn't mean she'd failed as a mother, but part of me thinks she never forgave herself for it. The story didn't quite sit right with me, with the pram rolling off all by itself, but I didn't want to interrogate her too much. My son was fine. That's what mattered. I just assumed the wheels on the pram hadn't locked properly or something, and maybe the wind blew or something bumped it. Now I know the truth. That was when it happened. That was the moment my life began to fall apart. Sarah started watching Alfie much more closely after that, a mother's guilt weighing heavy on her shoulders. She'd go running to him at any and every sound he made. I'd find her hovering above his crib, sometimes late into the night, watching him sleep. I noticed Alfie crying a lot more than he used to. He was never quiet by any means, but now it was almost constant. Sarah explained it to be hunger, that he was just growing. But I swear, some days she was feeding him every half hour. One day when I'd managed to convince Sarah to get some rest, I sat with Alfie in my arms, rocking him slowly, listening to his breathing. It was much deeper than before, much more strained, like the air scratched the inside of his throat on each exhale. I watched his chest move up and down with each labored breath, wondering just how a baby could eat so much and still look so skinny. The first visit to the doctor came when I walked into the baby's room to find Sarah propped up against the crib, half unconscious with blood leaking from her nipples. The mental image of Alfie laying asleep with crimson-stained lips still makes me shiver. The doctor couldn't find anything wrong with Alfie, giving us a few half-assed guesses, such as colic, suggesting we start using bottles if the feeding's too hard on Sarah's breasts. An air of judgment dripped from his words like venom. Sarah burst into tears on the drive home. We started feeding Alfie through bottles, something he took to without any difficulty, which I thank God for. Things seemed to be getting a little easier for a while, though we ended up needing to buy baby formula alongside the breast milk because he was eating it all. I did the math once. Alfie was eating something over 10 times what a baby was meant to eat. We were spending hundreds of pounds on anything the little man would let down his throat, but he never seemed to gain weight. His skin still taut on the ridges of his ribs. After returning home with bags filled mostly with baby formula, completely forgetting at this point to get anything for me and Sarah to eat, I found Sarah sat in the middle of the living room holding Alfie to her chest and crying. "I think he's sick," she managed to get out between sobs. Alfie's skin had turned a jaundiced yellow and felt rubbery, slick. When I finally managed to pry his eyes open, I found the same for them, the sclera now a murky, bloodshot brown. We took him back to the hospital where we sat, unable to even breathe as the doctors ran test after test after test after test after test. Enduring side eyes, whispered expressions of disgust. But they again didn't find anything. Nothing that could cause any of the symptoms. Even after monitoring him over several nights, the useless bastards couldn't find anything. Eventually, we just had to take him home. What the hell else were we supposed to do? Spend our entire lives in the hospital? Other than the yellow skin and the eating habits, there didn't seem to be anything else wrong. He wasn't in pain. He looked malnourished, but I could tell just by the void in my pocket that he was far from that. I just felt so fucking useless. Time was blending together at this point, whether due to the lack of sleep or the identical days. So I'm not exactly sure how many weeks it'd been since me and my wife had slept in the same bed, but I think Alfie was about 4 months old. We were on a schedule of shifts. One of us would sit with Alfie, feeding him over and over, while the other person stole a few hours of darkness. One time I had run out of bottles, but didn't want to wake Sarah. She was coming apart at the seams. We both were. It was agony to see her like that. This woman I thought could take on the whole world, now with frazzled, unkempt hair, sagging skin, permanently rheumy eyes. We hadn't even washed our clothes in weeks. I don't think she had a single shirt that didn't have bloodstains on the chest. I wanted Sarah to have at least one full night's sleep, so I let Alfie suckle on the tip of my finger, hoping that it'd delay the mind-breaking wailing by just a few more minutes. And it worked. The silence was so blissful I began to nod off myself. But just as my eyelids made my vision flicker, a sharp pain shot through my hand and woke me right back up. I yelped, yanked my hand from Alfie's mouth, almost throwing him off me on instinct. Immediately he began screaming, the sound cutting into my eardrums with a similar pain to what I'd just felt in my hand, but I was unbothered, my attention absorbed entirely by the bead of blood trickling down from the tip of my index finger. Sarah and I had basically stopped speaking to each other unless it was about Alfie. No more giggle-filled conversations about the most ridiculous things, no more romantic dinners and inside jokes, no more intimacy, emotional or physical. No more love. Just two zombies funneling milk into a screaming infant, like insects whose sole reason for existence was to feed their queen. I stopped on the doorstep after a shopping trip once, my forehead pressing against the door as I listened to Alfie's screams pierce through the walls like bullets from a machine gun. I could hear it through the entire street as I walked. I heard comments and complaints from just about every person who lived anywhere near us. I'm ashamed of it, but I thought about turning around, walking back to the shop, to a pub, anywhere. I wanted to not hear it for a while. It was strange. It'd been just 5 months, almost nothing in the grand scheme of things, yet it felt like looking after Alfie was all I'd ever done. I could barely remember life before. I struggled to recall the names of friends I'd celebrated with when he was born. I knew going into it that having a kid was supposed to change your life, but I'd been utterly consumed by it. I tried to smother those disgusting thoughts, but they didn't relent until I heard Sarah inside. "Shut the fuck up!" along with glass shattering and thud. With my heart trying to burst out of my chest, I dropped the shopping at the door, and I rushed inside. I heard another smash before I reached the room, finding glass and ceramic strewn across the floor. Alfie was on the kitchen table, screaming so hard his yellow face was turning shades of purple. "Shut up! Shut up!" Sarah kept shouting as she picked up another plate to throw. Her pale face was covered in tears and snot, and her neck and arms bearing scratches that oozed blood. I grabbed her and yanked her back, asking what the fuck she was doing. "I can't do it! He won't stop! He won't stop! I can't! I hate him!" She gasped when she realized what she had said. dread tightening around her pupils before she burst back into tears. I sat her down in the living room before returning to Alfie, doing everything I could to get him to finish the 2 bottles Sarah had been trying to give him. It took me almost an hour to finally get him to quiet down. I put him to bed and quickly rushed back to my wife, hoping we could talk in the 5 minutes of quiet it bought us. Sarah sat on the sofa, rocking back and forth as she cried, her hands balled at her ears with clumps of hair that she had ripped out. I crouched down in front of her, placing my hands on her bouncing knees. "Can you look at me?" I asked. She shook her head rapidly. "Can't do it, Jack. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to fix it. I wanted to hurt him." But you didn't. I cut her off. "He's fine." I caught myself because fine was the last word I'd used to describe any of this. "He's not hurt." I didn't know what else to say. Sarah was the capable one. Sarah was the one with the answers. What the fuck could I do? Eventually, I found the words. I suggested that maybe we needed some time to ourselves. I could call my mom, ask her to watch Alfie for a bit, and we could go out together, or stay in, or do anything we wanted. Feel like people again. She shook her head and tearfully argued that it wouldn't be right to dump Alfie on anyone, especially my arthritic mother, who would have had to drive down from Scotland. Because that's Sarah. A stubborn bitch. She'd rather die than let someone else carry her problems for her. Trying to think of something else, I realized that in all the stress of looking for Alfie, she stopped seeing her therapist. So, I suggested that she start going again, and she sobbed harder, murmuring to herself about being a terrible mother. I held her until Alfie started crying again. A few days that melded together later, and Sarah had a meeting with her shrink. I encouraged it, but also dreaded having to be alone with my infant son. His screams bursting through my eardrums as I mixed formula until my fingers ached, but much to my surprise, a little bit after Sarah left, Alfie was quiet. It took me some time to realize, my fatigued body in autopilot, but at some point it hit me that the screaming I was hearing was just the echoes in my head, and Alfie was laying in his crib, perfectly tranquil. It terrified me at first. I thought he was sick or hurt, but when I picked him up, he was fine. I sat in my living room, rocking him in my arms. I watched the television like I used to just after he was born, like I used to before that day Sarah took him out. Though he was still bony and yellow, and fussed for feeding every half hour, he wasn't screaming. It racked my mind wondering what I did to calm him down, but the only difference I could find was Sarah's absence. My heart felt heavy at the prospect of telling her. I thought she'd read into it in a bad way. It had to be coincidence, but there was no way that she'd think that. My fears were in vain, though. When she returned home, she seemed okay, quiet, maybe a little cold. I chalked it up as the come-down from an emotional conversation, but when she looked at Alfie in my arms, there was something in her eye that almost made me wince. I don't really know how to put it into words. Not hate, not apathy, just suspicion. She seemed withdrawn for the rest of the day, not going anywhere near Alfie. Again, I just assumed maybe whatever she'd discussed with the shrink had left her emotionally drained. I considered asking her about it, but figured that wasn't the kind of thing that should be shared, even with me. I decided just to give her space and time to figure herself out. What I would give to go back and change that decision. Maybe we could have worked it out together. Maybe I could have helped her. She watched me feed Alfie and put him to bed, and when I pushed through my worry and expressed amazement at how he was still quiet, she just shrugged. She volunteered to watch over him that night to make up for leaving me alone and encouraged me to get some sleep. I suggested that maybe she should come to bed too, that maybe whatever it was that was wrong is now over. Maybe it was just colic. That he's quiet now, and we'd be able to get some real rest. I was halfway begging. I just wanted to share a bed with my wife again. She shook her head, her dispassionate eyes analyzing our son's skinny yellow body as his prominent ribcage slowly rose and fell. Her arms crossed tight over her chest, her face struggling to keep the sneer suppressed. Apprehensively, I relented, recognizing the look of stoic resignation that she'd put on when making a tough decision, and knowing that look meant she'd made her choice. Sarah was always a stubborn bitch. Once she'd made up her mind about something, it was impossible to talk her out of it. So I went to bed. But even with now months' worth of sleep that I'd accumulated, sleep was distant. I had this terrible sensation churning in my gut and an alien buzzing in my brain. An intuition. Even now, I don't think I could say for certain what it was, some nebulous sensation, but it made the echoes of Alfie's cries in my head become deafening. I listened as Sarah went downstairs, a heaviness in her steps. I listened to the banging as she rooted around the piled-up dishes and bottles in the kitchen. I listened as she marched back upstairs, each thump making my breath hitch. Horrible stir roiling in my stomach like rocks in a washing machine. Eventually, the arcane feeling of my skull wanting to cave in became unbearable. I got up and with the slow, soft steps crossed the hall back to Alfie's room. I peeked back inside to see Sarah hovering over the crib like she would just after she had lost him on that day. My lips fought against my unease, trying to smile, thinking she was just wary of why Alfie was suddenly quiet. But then I noticed the knife in her hand. I stepped inside and quietly called her name. Sarah? She brought the knife up, and before my mind had time to truly process what I was seeing, I darted across the room. The blade came down on the edge of the crib as I yanked her backwards. Sarah, what the fuck? Alfie began screaming, as did Sarah. Get off me! Her arms flailing wildly, her elbow catching me on the chin. One hand with a death grip on the crib, the other thrashing out at my son with a knife. Sarah fought me. It's not him, Jack! Get away! Let go! Her yells were drowned out by my son's terrified wailing. We'd pulled the crib halfway across the room at this point, and Sarah would not let go, her legs kicking out and whacking against the crib, each flash of the blade making my heart jump. Wrapping one arm fully around her waist, I freed her hand and used it to pry her grip from the crib, digging my nails into the flesh of her wrist, making her cry out. When she finally let go, I swung her around and threw her out the door. She thrashed her knife as she fell into the hallway, slashing me across the forearm, making me stumble backwards. I looked back and met her terrified eyes. She looked at the blood pouring in rivulets down my arm, then the scarlet-stained knife in her hand. Jack, please, she begged between heavy pants. Please believe me, that's not Alfie. That thing is not our son. I kept my hands raised in front of me, non-threateningly. Alfie's screams dampening into quiet mewls. Please put the knife down. We can call the therapist. And we can talk about this, okay? It's gonna be all right. I promise. This was a promise I couldn't fulfill. Sarah shook her head, a deluge of tears pooling in her eyes, her jaw tight as the knife shook in her hand. It's not him, Jack, she whimpered, her eyes suddenly bulging open as she pointed with the knife, making me flinch. Look! Look what he's doing! She cried out. I cut my gaze to Alfie as he rolled onto his side, writhing in the crib, As helpless as I felt, letting out a couple cries, presumably upset by his mother's shouting. Controlling my breathing, I took a step towards Sarah, keeping myself between her and Alfie. "Put the knife down," I pleaded. "That's not Alfie!" she shouted again. Growing frantic, the woman I love, now a rabid animal. "That's not my son!" My eyes kept darting to the door, which she must have noticed, suddenly becoming quiet, her face sharpening with determination. After a moment that felt like an eternity, I dashed forward. Sarah moved to block me, but I punched her in the face, sending her sprawling out into the hallway again, stunning her long enough to slam the door shut. I had just enough time to pull a wardrobe over to block the door before Sarah slammed herself against it, her mournful wail shattering something deep inside of me. She hammered against the door, the metallic thuds as she slammed the knife against the wood. "Jack, no, please, it's not Alfie, please listen. It's a monster, it took him. Jack, please let me in, I can show you." I grabbed my phone and called the police, my voice shaking as I described a scene I didn't want to believe was really happening. The time I sat there with my son, Sarah begged me to open the door, begged me to realize that thing in the crib was not my son. It felt like an eternity. When I assumed be repeated for me endlessly when I reached hell. I cried my fucking eyes out when I heard them kick in the door and drag her away. People told me all kinds of reasons and excuses, mental breakdown, psychosis. I didn't care about the why or the how. The pain that comes from fighting the belief that the woman you loved for the most of your life is actually a monster is something words can't define or assuage. My wife was gone. Now all I had was my son. Nothing else mattered. After trying to explain to the police the same things she told me, Sarah was put in a psychiatric facility. I tried to visit her a few times, but all she'd do was scream at me, pleading to find Alfie and kill the thing that stole his place. Eventually, it became too painful to see her, so I stopped going. I abandoned her in there. I betrayed my vows by abandoning the person who showed me what it's like to live. Alfie stopped crying almost completely after that. He'd whine when he wanted feeding every 30 minutes, but other than that, he was quiet. Made me wonder if Sarah had been doing something to him to make him the way that he was. Maybe she'd been hurting him or poisoning him. I read up on Munchausen syndrome by proxy, read up on postpartum psychosis, just about every other disorder I could find. Not a day went by where I didn't break down sobbing. I wanted to give up, wanted to fade into the cloud of darkness that had encompassed my life. Like a stone sinking into the sea, but I couldn't. So I put the pain into caring for my son, into finding the strength to do all the things that had once been shared between the two of us. I switched off all those parts of myself that Sarah had once nurtured until the only thing I had the capacity to feel was a father's love. My mom was insistent she'd come down to London to help me, but I fought her off. Every time she offered it, I'd become almost nauseous at the prospect, like my body was repulsed by the idea of not doing this alone, at the possibility of what happened to Sarah happening again somehow. I think the only reason I still answered her daily calls was because if I didn't, she would want to appear at my doorstep unbidden. I can't recall how much time passed between Sarah's meltdown and the day I collapsed. I must have been months, might have been years. Time for me is a melange of hazy splotches. I remember just before I collapsed, I put Alfie in his high chair in the kitchen, and I stepped into the living room for something. And I remember waking up on the floor. My cheek prickled against the crusty carpet, sticky blood growing cold on my face. I struggled to find my senses, my body fighting off consciousness to reclaim some of my deteriorating mind. "Are you dead already?" chuckled a breathless voice so gravelly the speaker sounded in pain. When my eyelids finally found the strength to flutter open, my hazy gaze was absorbed by a tall, thin figure hovering over me, watching me. I writhed and groaned, my limbs refusing to listen to my brain's signals. I managed to lift my arms and roll onto my stomach as a deep laugh filled the air like chlorine gas, making my blood icy in my veins. I smelled blood and feces, and I could taste dirt. Blinking moisture into my eyes and clearing my throat, the dream vision disappeared with a pitter-patter in the kitchen, and when I lifted my head, I was alone. Great. I'm psycho now, too. I pulled myself up and sat against the sofa, my bones throbbing as I watched my hands tremble. My head was bleeding. Suppose I'd hit it when I fell. At the time, I assumed it was exhaustion and the stress getting the better of me. I needed help. I warred with myself, practically begged myself to call my mom and ask her to save me like she always would. The thought of her face made me want to vomit. I knew I should go to the doctor, but again, the idea fought me. The prospect of describing my situation to anyone made me angrier than I'd ever been before, strings of violence tugging at my mind. Thinking back to when we'd taken Alfie to the hospital made me hate my wife even more than I'd grown to. I cried, feeling almost completely alone with only my son. I finally found the strength to stagger upstairs, finding Alfie in his crib. When he saw me, he giggled and reached up a thin yellow hand to me. I looked down upon his frail skeletal frame, his rubbery, jaundiced skin, bloodshot yellow eyes with black irises, and for a moment, I was disgusted by the creature before me. But it was only for a moment. Alfie giggled and wiggled his arms again, and love filled my chest like an aggressive cancer. I picked him up and I cradled him, tears burning my cheeks as I laughed with him. He pawed at me and murmured the way he does when he's hungry. I carried him downstairs and let him watch me prepare the bottle of milk. I sat with him in the living room and let him ravenously devour every drop in the bottle, almost pulling it from my fingers several times. My breath caught in my throat, the warmth of adoration wrapping around me like python coiling around a rat. When I pulled the rubber nipple from his mouth, there was a crimson smear left on it. I looked down at the blood stain in the carpet, realizing it was the same color. My heart sank into the ground. I tossed the bottle immediately and began examining him, running my finger along with the inside of his lips. Alfie stopped fussing instantly. In fact, he went deathly still. His eyes narrow with this calculation that seemed strange on the face of a baby. Even when I poked and prodded his gums, he didn't fidget. He just watched me. I hissed when a sharp pain cut into my finger. I pulled it from his mouth and watched blood bead on the tip. With my pinky, I folded his lips back and looked closely at the dark purplish gums in my baby's mouth. It felt like a winter wind washed over my shoulders as I stared down at the tiny needle-like points poking out. I blinked several times, wondering if maybe I'd hit my head harder than I thought. Maybe I was still dreaming, but it's when I noticed how he was looking at me that the world went silent. His face was cold, stony. His eyes were filled with contempt, an expression an infant was not meant to display. "All right, mate, let's get you back in bed," I said, with forced cheer and a chuckle that I had to squeeze out of my diaphragm. I don't think he bought it. His icy stare remaining fixed on me until I closed the door to his room behind me. My heart was racing so fast I was worried I'd cough it up. My mind was a cacophony of noise, but there was one thing I couldn't stop thinking. Sarah's words. That's not Alfie. I closed myself in my bedroom in a panic. Couldn't be real. It must have been having a breakdown like Sarah did. It's a monster. That was my son. My fucking blood, my flesh, part of me. He was just teething. That had to be it. Wasn't he about that age? I couldn't remember. Why couldn't I remember how old my son was? I couldn't remember anything. I couldn't remember my friends' names. I couldn't remember my mother's address. I couldn't even remember where I'd bought the formula I'd been feeding him. Feeding it. No, this was insane. I was sleep deprived. Stressed from having my wife try to kill me and my son. I was having some kind of mental health crisis, and I needed to finally get some help. I searched around for my phone and eventually, leaving my room to search the house under every pillow, and found it in the toilet. The screen smashed. Dead and unusable. I never brought my phone into the bathroom. Moving back upstairs, I peeked into Alfie's room. He was sat upright in his crib, watching me plainly, curiously. He never sat up before that. And I had a nasty realization settle in my gut. It knew. It knew that I knew. Like Sarah knew. I closed myself in my bedroom again and blocked the door, remaining hidden away until the sun rose the next day. Alfie started crying at some point, but after a while he realized I wasn't coming and stopped, remaining silent for the rest of the night. After a shit ton of Googling, I concocted a plan that I was sure certified me as a nutcase because I had to be certain. Before I did anything, I needed to be 100% fucking certain. And when daylight turned the outside world into a blinding wasteland, reminding me of just how alone I was, I left the room to gather what I needed. As I put the things together, I felt stupid. Everything in me screaming that this was ridiculous. Alfie was my son. I was having a crisis, and I needed to stop. But there was something deep inside me that knew I had to do this. Once I had everything together, I made my way back to Alfie's room. He was laying in his crib, his skeletal chest pulsing with shallow breaths. I drifted through the room, very hesitantly turning my back on him as I laid everything out on the changing table. Then I began. I opened the carton and plucked up the first egg, cracking the shell on the side of the pot before dumping the content onto the floor beside my feet. Then I placed the shells into the pot and began to stir. I did it again and again. On the third egg, Alfie laughed, making me freeze while I listened to the creaking of the crib as he moved. I repeated the absurd action until the contents of nearly a dozen eggs covered the floor, my socks soaked with yolk. I then placed the empty carton on my head and took the pot in both hands and began tossing the eggshells like you would an omelet. Alfie laughed again. And then it happened. Why are you doing that? A strained, harsh, gravelly voice cut through the silence like a lightning bolt. My eyes burned and vision blurred as tears threatened to drown me. Sarah was right. She was right. And I didn't fucking listen. My entire body trembling with fear, I placed the pot filled with eggshells onto the changing table. I didn't look at it, I just, as calmly as I could manage, walked out of the room and into my bedroom, piling half the furniture in front of the door to give me the time to type this up. Alfie's been crying louder than he ever had before. The noise like sandpaper raking my brain, but now he's suddenly stopped. I'm not sure if I'm losing it, but I'm certain I just heard the door handle jostle. There's an occasional creak now on the wall, on the stairs, the floorboards, as if it's moving around the house, trying to be quiet, waiting for me to come out. I'm not sure exactly why I'm writing this. I mean, maybe someone could use this to see the signs I missed. Maybe I just hope at least one person in the world won't think I'm an evil piece of shit for what I'm about to do. Maybe I'm just using this to delay the inevitable. And once I've done what I know needs to be done, I'll come back and I'll type up an update for what happened. But Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm sorry. I'm so fucking sorry.